Welcome. We have a unique opportunity to peek into the tumultuous period of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries through the eyes of some of the great artists of the time. Here to give us the inside story is Michael Tomar, who's director of the El Paso Museum of Art. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you here and very excited about this exhibit. What is so special about this exhibit that you've brought here?
Well, I think it's the first time that the El Paso Museum of Art has ever really taken a critical look at the Golden Age, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And we have this really wonderful opportunity. We're only one of 5 venues across the country to have an opportunity to see these remarkable works by some of the great masters of the 17th and 18th centuries and really have a discussion about what was happening in Europe at the time, really setting the stage for some of the most incredible art that ever came to pass.
So I guess people don't realize how interesting and relevant art is to the lives of people at that time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the majority of people were illiterate to the written word, and so these works of art, in many ways, were their textbooks. They're the books that they would read, and they understood visual language so much better than we do. But of course, we're really literate in the written word and the spoken word. So.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at you have some major artists represented here, right?
We really do.
Rembrandt and from the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation both. So who would be some of the big names that people are going to see there?
I think, I think Rembrandt is a good place to start, and then maybe someone who's very different in style than Rembrandt would be Peter Paul Rubens.
Right.
Both of them were located in different parts of the Netherlands. One was really overseen by the Catholic Crown, the Spanish Empire, and the other became an independent nation called the United Provinces, which was completely Protestant. And so all of the Netherlands that we know today was really divided into 2 sections as a result of the Reformation and the 80 Years' War. So 2 very different artists, 2 very different parts of life, and in a very similar geographic region. And
so how, just using Rembrandt and Rubens and a couple of their works, how are those 2 different kinds of things portrayed? When you're looking at a painting, what are you going to see that would say, yeah, this is totally different from this one?
Well, it's a great comparison. I'm glad you asked, because Peter Paul Rubens wasn't just an artist. He was also a very important diplomat. And so his travels throughout Europe as a diplomat for the Catholic Crown really landed him commissions with the King and Queen of France, as well doing commissions for the Pope, the King and Queen of Spain, and he worked all throughout Europe as a diplomat, and his works are spread all throughout Western Europe. Now, Rembrandt, on the other hand, was highly sought after, but really for his portraiture, and the portraiture and some of his religious scenes, but mostly his portraiture, were really reflections of the people that surrounded him. In the Protestant United Provinces, the northern part of the Netherlands, Rembrandt was known for doing portraits of the wealthy emerging middle class. So Rubens and Rembrandt, very different. We've got somebody working for a very affluent group of people, but also the courts and the Catholic Crown, and you've got somebody working for a middle class, a rising middle class.
So what you're seeing here then, I guess, is a reflection of what was going on politically and religiously at the time, which was a major schism between the Catholic Church and the Protestants, or the people would be reformers, right?
Exactly.
And that's represented in the art.
It is, and what's not represented in the art is just as interesting as what is. So when we don't see religious images coming out of some of the more Protestant-leaning countries, the Germanic countries in particular, and in the northern parts of the Netherlands, we don't see as many religious images, but we do in the south, and we see them also in Central Europe, especially in France. So we see 2 completely things happening simultaneously.
Right. That's fascinating when you think about it. So the Reformation had an effect on the Catholic Church, which prior to that had corruption and that kind of thing going on, and so reforms were made. And how were those? What were the reforms, and how were they reflected in the art?
Well, definitely there were people out there who felt that there were directions of the Catholic Church that were not the directions of the people, and primarily starting with Martin Luther and Calvin, a German and a French guy, who say, look, we're not thrilled with the rigidness of the Catholic Church. There was a dissatisfaction with what was called indulgences, people buying the contributions being equated to the level of salvation that someone could have. And these reform movements were very important, and it really caused a change in the way that people saw their environment. And one of the big changes in art was that religious images were banned from churches amongst the reform movement geographic regions. So we don't really see a lot of commissions for telling religious stories through art.
And why were they banned?
Because there was a sense that the religious images within the church had started to replace an individual's spiritual being, that they were now praying to the image themselves.
Kind of idolatry, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
and that they felt that it was overwhelming the people and moving them away from inner spirituality to something, just as you said, as idolatry, that they were worshiping the images.
And hence that's kind of the thread carries through in the whole movement with the Pilgrims and all of that related to America, and the austere approach that they took to life and the portrayal of things.
That's right.
That we associate with the whole Pilgrim era.
Absolutely, and you see the portrait, the only painting by Rembrandt in the exhibition is a very beautiful, sensitive portrait of a Mennonite woman, one of the more extreme of the Protestant movements, but an important one. And she's married actually to a wealthy merchant who was able to rise through the classes and may have his own wealth. But when you see this portrait of her, you understand the austerity and the severity that you're reflecting, that she truly is very humble, that she's not ordained with or decorated with jewelry and makeup. She really is very simple and presented to be very pure. And this was something that reflected itself in the interiors of churches and also the way that people kept their homes and how they reflected themselves in their own moral attitude. So throughout the paintings of this exhibition, you get a glimpse into the life of these very modest people when it came to their morality, but also very proud of who they were and in their new wealth.
Right. And so part of the Protestant Reformation also allowed, they were coming out from the Catholic hierarchy and the monarchy and that the whole land system being dominated by those two entities where people had private property and became wealthy and that sort of thing.
That's right.
And so they showed things like, you see portraits of food and flowers and all kinds of things.
Yeah, and never too far away from the morality issues that were important to those people at the time. For example, when you see still life paintings in this exhibition, there is never a missed opportunity to talk about what's called vanitas, or the fleeting moments of time. So when you see a still life and you have maybe a half-eaten piece of bread, or there's a clock on the table, you might see some flowers that are wilted. These are reflections and reminders that your time on earth is precious and you should take advantage of every moment. So it's about the passage of time. But they're also beautiful still lifes and beautiful flowers. And these people were very proud of the fact that they could afford tulip bulbs. There was a huge tulip bulb craze going on in the Netherlands. And that was a reflection of wealth, that you could actually import these things from the East. They grew very well in the North. And so if you had tulips, you wanted to see them year-round in your painting maybe, but you also wanted to show off that this is something that's a part of your life that you're proud of. Same thing with landscapes. For the very first time, that people were really, they wanted people to know about their land and how beautiful it was. And so we're seeing landscapes emerge as a genre in art for the very first time in the history of art.
And that's hard to imagine, but it was the first time that they actually painted natural scenery like that. In the Renaissance, it was much more of a classical approach to things. And
that's right. Everything had
Yeah.
a purpose and a meaning. And if there was a landscape, it was more of a context of something else. But this is really, people were commissioning artists to paint what they own, their
Right.
land.
Yeah, show it off,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, sort of the old version of Facebook, I guess, posting those images on there. Now, looking at the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and then this whole genre of art and religious thought of reform influenced the Catholic Church, which it also used art as a way of communicating kind of a new level of commitment to Reformation in its own right, to reform of the church and some of the things that people were not happy with, right?
I mean, they stood their grounds on some things, but I think what they recognized was that they were losing touch with the general population. And so how that manifests itself in art is very interesting. The artists begin for the very first time to paint from life. In other words, it was not unusual to take sketches and take that back to the studio, but now we have artists actually painting with a living model right in front of them. And by the way, not women, it would have been inappropriate, but men, especially as models for saints, as models for the religious figures. This was important because they wanted the public to have some sort of a visual identity with whoever was in the painting. Before, they were very idealized or they were based on sculpture, but for the first time you might actually say to yourself, that looks like my Uncle Harry, or this could be the next door neighbor. And so there's a direct relationship to spirituality and the ability for you as an individual to reach that level. Before, it was a little bit more of an admiration of an idealization. Now, you look like that person. You know it. This could be a family member. You're identifying with them. We see this now, and the church really mandates that in their phrasing on how to depict religious images.
So they actually set up guidelines. I think it was, you mentioned that they had guidelines about what was to be portrayed and how it was to be portrayed.
That's right, and what should be portrayed. When the church finally regrouped during the Council of Trent in the 1560s, it was important that they take a look at the religious imagery context in the discussion. And they said that nothing extraneous should be in these narratives that are representing the Gospels, only the most important information, and you should have a relationship to these people as humans as well as much as spiritual beings. And of course, no nudity or lasciviousness that could spawn any type of attractiveness to the figures, but it should be simple and direct and yet beautiful, and so that people can connect with it. And it's an edict that came out of the Council of Trent of what can and can't be there. Some people were actually excommunicated. People were brought up on charges for putting in images into subjects that had no relevance to that. We see documents about this all the time. So they were very, very specific about this. Yeah.
And it's portrayed in a couple of pictures at least that you have St. Jerome, and then also, I was trying to recall the other.
Right, there's a beautiful painting of the Ecce Homo. Here is the man, Pontius Pilate is, standing there. He looks a little bit Turkish, his skin's a little bit darker. Christ is a little bit more light skin colored. There's a relationship that's important with that because this was probably being commissioned by somebody from the Netherlandish region. And it is an incredible piece that really focuses on the discussion about what happens next in the life story of Christ, which is right before Christ is led off to Calvary for crucifixion. It's that tender moment where all directions point to this is the end. And then the style of painting is similar in terms of the light and dark to the portrait of St. Jerome. That's right. There was an interesting new style that developed out of painting from life and also eliminating any extraneous people or animals or landscapes from these scenes. So the background becomes very dark and unimportant. What's important are the main figures in these historical discussions, whether they be religious or mythological. In these religious discussions in particular, only the most important people are being represented. So they're really spotlit, very dramatic. The background is very dark, and there's a real focus so that they're focusing your attention as the viewer on what's the most significant. The piece of St. Jerome is just really stunning, and you can tell he's an elderly man, and his flesh is wrinkled, and his face is so sincere and spiritual, and all of that was important for the artist to translate.
So the church would have commissioned one kind of art, and then the wealthy landowners and the merchant class were also commissioning art, and they were commissioning something that was quite different.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it would change and evolve over the 150, 200-year time period that we're talking about. There was something called the Grand Tour, where a formal education of somebody who was a little bit more affluent or well-off would take a tour of Europe. I mean, sometimes we think about that like, are you going to Europe after you graduate from high school? Well, there it was part of the finishing school, or finishing ideas for kind of highbrow for people to take the tours. Now, they were also buying paintings, and they were buying what might be the equivalent of postcards, except that they were much more glorious, large paintings of scenes. They would have portraits done of themselves. And the function of art for those people who were on the Grand Tour was recollections of their trip, making sure that the people who sent them or their communities saw what they saw. And we have all new types of art being developed as a result of that. Picture scenes and beautiful landscapes and architecture from Rome and portraits of oneself reading great books. And so all new artwork is being developed out of that too.
And how were the artists able to be financially successful? Or were they starving artists? How did that work to actually have the profession of being an artist at that time?
I think reputation had a lot to do with it. I think that once an artist was stationary for a long enough period of time and gained some ground, I think that people would seek them out. And so artists like Giuseppe Ribera, who's down in Naples, was really known for his scenes of saints. And I think people would seek him out. Artists would seek him out to train, that he would train them, but people would seek him out because they wanted one of his paintings of a saint. And they would have very large workshops. And they would have some finished, some unfinished paintings, and people would come and say, well, I like that image of a saint, but I want this particular image to go along with it. They would paint that up for them because these people were primarily being commissioned. Rather than making the decisions and hoping to sell, there would be examples of their work, and people would come and commission them to do something specific for them. The notion of an artist painting and using their own money to that degree, their own money to buy oil and canvas and hoping like heck that somebody buys their artwork, it's really a very modern thought, and that doesn't really happen until the middle of the 19th century. The time we're talking about, these artists were really being paid to do specific things, and their input was less significant to the patron.
And so they're not, it's not self-expression or their agenda, as we have the sense of that more in more contemporary art. For them, it's a job to a certain extent.
That's right, and remember that visual literacy is everything with this population base. So if you're expressing yourself with your own language and the people can't read what you've painted, you're not going to sell your work. So being very faithful to a language that was understood by your viewership was critical. Very few artists strayed from that. And so this self-expression that we have today is akin to a large group of people coming together speaking all different languages to each other, and no one knows the language that they're speaking. So you can evaluate that person, but maybe just on how they're dressed and their demeanor. You don't really know too much about them because it's a language that you're not understanding. These artists were really painting for a population that understood exactly what they were saying, and that was important. So they made money that way.
Right. Now, what would be some of the symbolism and imagery beyond just, you know, this is a saint or this is Adam and Eve kind of thing that people would recognize in the paintings and that we would see in the show?
I'll talk about a beautiful little still life
Okay.
that's there, because I think it's kind of interesting, is that, and it was done by a Flemish artist who did a beautiful still life of the Eucharist sitting on top of a goblet, which would have held the blood of Christ or the wine. And all throughout the piece are all the symbols of the body and blood of Christ, which are beautifully rendered. So you have these beautiful wheat shafts that create a cornucopia that are reminiscent of the ultimate ingredient of bread. And you've got these beautiful flowers that are in there, all representing birth or the birth of spring. And human souls were often seen symbolically with tiny little birds and butterflies flying around the chalice. So that's a really lovely way. And then, of course, we've got these very large, huge paintings as well. Paul and Barnabas preaching and healing. And these are large canvases. That one in particular by Jacob Jordan's. Or we've got this beautiful portrait of Louis XV's daughter Adelaide by a very, very important female artist named Adelaide Lebeau-Guillard. Just a stunning piece, and life-size. So we would be seeing, you would be seeing quite a bit.
Yeah. So in terms of this imagery and symbolism would be generally recognized by the people of the time.
Absolutely.
You know, that they would know that what that meant to a certain extent anyway.
Yeah, there's a beautiful, not a portrait, but a beautiful image of Anne teaching the Virgin Mary, her daughter, about life. It's called The Education of the Virgin. A very important topic in the 18th century about the role of women in teaching their little girls about proper education to their children. And it's a touching, very tender moment between a mother and a daughter, but symbolically it represents a lot of what the church was trying to get across to the public, which is it's your responsibility on a moral level to educate your children. And then on a spiritual level, Anne and Mary are very important to one another.
Now, where would the paintings from the church be displayed? Would they be displayed in churches, pretty much?
Yeah, the larger paintings that you'll see in the exhibition are primarily commissions that were done for people that would have side chapels in churches, especially the religious images. The smaller ones would be for personal devotion, so they might take those home with them and have them in their home. Not that they would pray to them, but they would reflect upon them because these are their visual books. The still lifes and landscapes and portraits would be hung in people's homes the way that we hang them today.
So again, two fairly different uses for the different genres of art.
That's right. That's right.
How did these pieces of art influence society? Did we see an influence from them?
I think so. I think that as the visual texts, really, I think that people continued to learn and be reminded of proper moral etiquette and maybe even who they would aspire to become, whether it be in the church or whether it be in life. So if you see a beautiful seascape, for example, of a ship, this is a reflection of a wealthy merchant who was very important in commerce. When you saw that type of image, this is something that you might aspire to become, and it perpetuates the notion that you have the ability to be that person that owns that ship or is in trade, in the same way that I think the church hoped that you'd look upon an image of, let's say, Anne and the Virgin and say, I can be that kind of mother and teach my children. So I think it really did change society.
It was used intentionally that way and then also subtly that way, it sounds like.
That's right. I think, certainly we can look at a lot of this work as propaganda, promoting oneself or promoting the church, promoting doctrine, promoting movements. And these were, in some ways, important marketing tools about what was being shared in the public. I don't want to demean the role of it, but I do think that there are certain pieces of information that are being shared for specific reasons. I don't think anything's arbitrary along those lines.
And then I think you said that the painting about Lazarus, which is quite spectacular, was one that was kind of along those lines as well.
Yeah, when you see images like Paul and Barnabas or the raising of Lazarus, these wonderful images that are being pulled from the Gospels, we might want to keep in mind that these were important vehicles for the church to talk about salvation, resurrection, but also conversion. If you're impressing a group of people that are onlooking and you're not really a believer and you see a miracle that happens before your eyes, there's a good chance that you might be converted to a faith. And the church was constantly in a position of converting people, especially after the Reformation and trying to gain back a fold. But there was constant conversion going on all the way from the late 15th century with Isabel and Ferdinand, all the way through the 18th century of Jews and Muslims and other faiths that were not of the Catholic faith. So this is a tradition, and it shows up in the artwork.
Right. And I don't think that most of us have any concept of the impact of these things, because we are so image-laden in our society, and those things were very unusual for them to behold. They didn't, in the average home, you didn't have paintings and imagery and that kind of thing. They could not afford it, right?
Right. The majority of people couldn't afford to buy a painting. They might, by chance, have small prints. Printmaking at that time was important. There would be a print of maybe an important painting that would tell a story, or picture books, prints that would go along with the Bibles. That was not unusual at the time. But to actually see these things in their glory and their color, I think had a huge impact on the way people viewed themselves in their lives.
Right. So how long will the exhibit be at the Art Museum?
Well, I'm happy to say through January 6th. So it's running all the way through the holidays. And we are open 6 days a week. And we're open on Thursday evenings until 9, open Saturdays and Sundays. The only day we're closed is on Mondays. And we want everybody to have an opportunity to have this experience. I think it's pretty special and one that's unique to El Paso.
Well, it is a breathtaking exhibit. I've seen it, and it is a unique experience to see these things in person, to experience them that way. And I think more people need to have that experience, very definitely.
I think so too.
Yeah, it's different. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael.
Thank you. I
You've
enjoyed
been
it.
most enlightening.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. So have you gained some insight into the formation of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and how art relates to it? Are you motivated to go and see the exhibit at the El Paso Museum of Art? I hope so. Let's support and pray for culturally enriching opportunities which enhance the quality of life here in El Paso. Thank you so much for watching.